The coffee giant is feeling the heat, and it's not from the espresso machines. Starbucks, the brand that defined American coffee culture for decades, is now shuttering locations at an alarming rate. The company recently announced plans to close over 400 stores across North America, with hundreds of employees facing uncertain futures. For communities from California to Connecticut, these aren't just business decisions. They're local landmarks disappearing, gathering spaces vanishing, and economic anchors coming loose. What's driving this unprecedented contraction? The official explanation speaks of strategic restructuring and portfolio optimization. But beneath the corporate language lies a harsher reality. The coffee empire is buckling under economic pressures that trace directly back to the tariff policies championed by the Trump administration. These import taxes, marketed to the American public as tools for job creation and economic revival, have instead triggered a cascade of rising costs that even a retail behemoth like Starbucks cannot fully absorb. This isn't merely a story about one corporation's struggles. It's a window into a broader economic transformation that's reshaping American business, eliminating jobs, and fundamentally altering the competitive landscape. While Starbucks contracts, international competitors, particularly from China, are seizing market share with aggressive precision. The very trade policies designed to protect American enterprises are inadvertently clearing the path for foreign rivals to advance. The implications extend far beyond your morning latte. From trucking companies to packaging manufacturers, from construction contractors to agricultural importers, the economic tremors radiating from Starbucks' difficulties are being felt across dozens of industries. And this represents only the opening chapter of a crisis that economists warn could accelerate dramatically in the months ahead. In the following investigation, we'll trace the origins of this unfolding catastrophe, examine how tariff policies transformed operating costs into existential threats, and reveal how China is methodically exploiting every strategic misstep America makes. Subscribe now to ensure you stay informed as this situation develops, because what's happening to Starbucks today could reshape the American economy tomorrow. Let's begin. How tariffs transformed coffee from affordable to unattainable. The closure of hundreds of Starbucks locations didn't happen spontaneously. These shutdowns represent the inevitable outcome of a trade policy that fundamentally miscalculated how modern supply chains actually function. When the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs, reaching 30%, 60%, and in some cases 100% on imported goods, the declared objective was revitalizing domestic manufacturing and penalizing foreign competitors. The actual result? American companies found themselves strangled by cost increases they couldn't control and customers wouldn't tolerate. Starbucks operates through an intricate global network of suppliers, logistics partners, and vendors spanning multiple continents. The company's business model depends on the seamless flow of goods across international borders. So when punitive import taxes suddenly made foreign products drastically more expensive, the financial impact wasn't gradual. It was immediate and devastating. Consider the fundamental economics of coffee in America. This beverage, consumed by approximately 64% of American adults daily, comes almost entirely from overseas. The continental United States lacks the climate to grow coffee commercially, and while Hawaii and Puerto Rico produce limited quantities, their output barely registers against national consumption levels. This leaves America dependent on three primary sources: Brazil, Colombia, and Vietnam, countries that collectively dominate global coffee production. Recent tariff announcements targeting Brazilian imports have been particularly consequential. Brazilian coffee, hit with tariffs as high as 50%, forms the backbone of America's affordable coffee supply. To understand the price differential, consider this comparison. Hawaiian-grown coffee, produced domestically with American wages and land costs, sells for $30 to $40 per pound. Brazilian beans, by contrast, have historically entered the U.S. market at a small fraction of that cost, sometimes $3 to $5 per pound for wholesale buyers. That pricing gap isn't arbitrary. It reflects genuine differences in labor costs, agricultural efficiency, land availability, and economies of scale. Brazilian coffee farms operate on thousands of acres with optimized growing conditions. Hawaiian operations work with constrained geography and face some of the highest labor and operational costs in the world. Both produce quality coffee, but at wildly different price points. For decades, America's coffee affordability depended on this import system. Every $3 diner coffee, every office break room pot, every fast food breakfast combo, all relied on beans that crossed an ocean before reaching American consumers. When tariffs disrupted that equation, the math behind affordable coffee simply stopped working. The consequences materialized rapidly. Import companies, facing new taxes on every shipment, raised their prices immediately. Roasting facilities saw their input costs spike by 30% or more virtually overnight. Retailers, already operating on compressed margins in an inflation-stressed economy, confronted an impossible choice: absorb the increases and watch profits evaporate, or pass costs to customers and risk driving them away. Most chose the latter. Within weeks of the tariff implementations, consumers across the country noticed price jumps on coffee products. A latte that cost $4.50 suddenly rang up at $6 or $6.50. A pound of whole beans that retailed for $12 jumped to $16 or $18. For households already stretching budgets to cover rising costs in housing, healthcare, and groceries, luxury coffee spending became one of the first casualties. But the damage extended well beyond the beans themselves. Virtually everything involved in operating a modern coffee shop now costs more. Espresso machines manufactured overseas face tariff surcharges. Furniture imported from Asia carries additional duties. Paper cups, plastic lids, cardboard sleeves, stirrers, all subject to increased import taxes. Even cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment haven't escaped the cost increases. Starbucks watched its operating expenses explode across every category simultaneously. The company faced a brutal double squeeze: costs rising on one side, customer resistance hardening on the other. Internal financial models that had projected steady growth suddenly showed alarming losses. Store-level profitability, the fundamental metric determining which locations stay open, began deteriorating nationwide. Corporate leadership attempted to manage the crisis quietly, hoping the tariff situation might prove temporary or that creative cost-cutting could buy time. But as months passed with no policy reversal, the company's options narrowed. Executives eventually announced what they called a strategic optimization of our retail footprint, corporate language for closing stores that could no longer justify their expenses. For the employees receiving termination notices, for customers losing their neighborhood meeting spots, for commercial landlords losing anchor tenants, the terminology matters little. The reality is stark. Starbucks is retreating. Hundreds of locations that once generated jobs, served communities, and contributed to local tax bases are going dark. And the policy that triggered this chain reaction was explicitly marketed as pro-American business and pro-worker. The disconnect couldn't be sharper. Tariffs were supposed to bring manufacturing home and create American jobs. Instead, they've eliminated thousands of retail positions while making everyday products more expensive for everyone. Starbucks has become Exhibit A in demonstrating how import taxes designed to punish foreign producers actually punish American workers and consumers first. And this pattern isn't isolated to coffee shops. The same dynamics are unfolding across sectors that depend on global supply chains, which, in a modern economy, means virtually every sector. The question now isn't whether this crisis will spread, it's how much damage will accumulate before policymakers acknowledge the fundamental flaw in their strategy. But while American companies struggle with self-inflicted economic wounds, competitors abroad are watching carefully and moving swiftly to capitalize on every opening. The disconnect between corporate messaging and ground-level reality. Inside Starbucks corporate offices, a careful communication strategy is underway. CEO statements emphasize resilience, strategic vision, and long-term positioning. Press releases frame store closures as proactive business optimization rather than crisis response. Investor presentations highlight digital initiatives, menu innovation, and global expansion plans. The messaging is polished, confident, and relentlessly optimistic. On the ground, in actual Starbucks stores scattered across America, the picture looks drastically different. Employees report a consistent pattern that corporate communications never quite acknowledge: schedules shrinking without explanation, hours vanishing from weekly rosters, shifts being canceled with minimal notice. Workers who once counted on 30 or 35 hours per week suddenly find themselves scheduled for 15 or 20. Benefits that require minimum hour thresholds become unreachable. Paychecks that once covered rent now leave families scrambling. Store managers describe an increasingly difficult position. They're tasked with maintaining service standards and customer experience while working with reduced staff hours and tighter budgets. They watch valued team members leave, not because of poor performance, but because their positions were eliminated entirely. And when they ask regional leadership for clarity, they receive the same optimistic talking points that don't match the reality they're managing daily. This disconnect between corporate narrative and operational truth isn't accidental. Starbucks is a publicly traded corporation with thousands of shareholders, billions in market capitalization, and intense scrutiny from financial analysts. Executives understand precisely what happens if they publicly acknowledge the severity of their challenges. Stock prices become volatile. Investor confidence erodes. Competitors sense vulnerability. Negative headlines multiply. The business consequences of complete transparency, from leadership's perspective, seem too damaging to risk, so instead, the company carefully calibrates its public statements. Store closures become portfolio optimization. Layoffs become organizational realignment. Declining profitability becomes strategic investment in future growth. The language is designed to reassure rather than inform, to calm markets rather than acknowledge problems. But financial analysts aren't easily deceived. Wall Street professionals who scrutinize quarterly reports, examine profit margins, and model future performance can see past the corporate rhetoric. Independent analysis reveals what leadership won't state plainly. Same-store sales growth has stalled, profit margins are compressing, and expansion plans have been quietly suspended. The company's own financial disclosures, when read carefully, tell a story of mounting pressure and diminishing options. For workers caught between these two realities, the confident corporate messaging and the harsh daily truth, the cognitive dissonance is profound. They're told the company is strong and strategically positioned, yet they're living through hour cuts, store closures, and constant uncertainty about job security. Their direct experience contradicts everything they hear from leadership. And here's where the broader political failure becomes personal. Workers were told that tariff policies would protect American jobs, strengthen American businesses, and restore American manufacturing. They were promised that tough trade measures would bring opportunity and security. Instead, they're experiencing exactly the opposite: jobs disappearing, businesses struggling, and economic stability eroding. The employees losing hours at Starbucks represent precisely the demographic that tariffs were supposedly designed to help: working-class Americans in service and retail sectors. Yet these policies have directly undermined their economic security. The promised manufacturing renaissance hasn't materialized. The predicted job creation never arrived. What did arrive? Higher costs, business contraction, and employment instability. Starbucks workers aren't naive. They can see the broader pattern. When their hours get cut after coffee prices spike due to tariffs, they understand the connection. When stores close in their communities while corporate executives talk about Chinese competition, they recognize who's bearing the actual cost of these trade policies. This represents one of the most significant failures of the tariff strategy. it's harming precisely the people it claimed to protect. Blue-collar workers, service employees, people without college degrees, families living paycheck to paycheck, these are the Americans most directly damaged by policies marketed as being in their interest. And while Starbucks employees navigate this difficult reality in the United States, an entirely different dynamic is playing out overseas. In China, American brands that once seemed unassailable are discovering they're far more vulnerable than they realized. How Chinese competitors turned American retreat into strategic opportunity. While Starbucks contracts under the weight of tariff-driven cost increases in the United States, a very different story is unfolding in China, one that reveals how trade conflicts can backfire in unexpected ways. The tariff policies designed to weaken China's economic position have instead created opportunities for Chinese companies to displace American brands in one of the world's most lucrative consumer markets. For years, Starbucks represented far more than just coffee in China. It symbolized Western lifestyle, sophistication, and global culture. Chinese consumers, particularly in urban centers, embraced the brand as a status marker and a social destination. At its peak, Starbucks was opening a new store in China every 15 hours, making the country its fastest-growing and most strategically important international market. The company generated roughly $3 billion annually from Chinese operations, with ambitious plans to expand even further. But, that dominance is rapidly eroding. The primary challenger? Luckin Coffee, a homegrown Chinese chain that nearly collapsed in 2020 following an accounting scandal, but has since rebuilt itself into a formidable competitor. Luckin's strategy directly counters Starbucks' traditional approach: ultra-competitive pricing, aggressive digital integration, mobile-first ordering, and rapid expansion into lower-tier cities that Starbucks barely reached. The price differential is striking. While Starbucks charges 30 to 40 yuan, that's about $4 to $6, for standard beverages, Luckin frequently offers drinks for 10 to 15 yuan, or roughly $1.50 to $2.20, through app-based promotions. For Chinese consumers, especially younger buyers more focused on value than brand prestige, the choice increasingly favors the domestic option. Luckin isn't positioned as the cheap alternative. It's marketed as the smart, modern choice for digitally savvy consumers. And Luckin possesses a crucial structural advantage that Starbucks simply cannot replicate. Its entire supply chain, logistics network, and operational infrastructure exist within China's domestic economy. The company sources ingredients locally, manufactures equipment domestically, and operates within China's protected technology ecosystem. This means Luckin faces none of the tariff costs, import complications, or cross-border financial friction that increasingly burdens Starbucks' Chinese operations. Meanwhile, Starbucks China confronts multiple pressures simultaneously. Import tariffs raise costs for any ingredients or equipment sourced internationally. Real estate expenses in major Chinese cities remain extraordinarily high. Labor costs continue rising as China's economy develops. And most damaging of all, the company can't compete on price without destroying the premium positioning that justified its presence in the market. In response, Starbucks attempted price cuts on select items, reducing iced coffee and tea by approximately 5 yuan, or about 70 cents. But honestly, these modest adjustments haven't stopped the customer migration toward cheaper alternatives. When consumers can get similar drinks for half the price, incremental discounts from the premium brand rarely change behavior. The financial strain has become so severe that Starbucks China has attracted takeover interest. In July, the company received acquisition offers valued around $10 billion from Chinese buyers. Management hasn't accepted, but the mere existence of these offers signals how dramatically the situation has deteriorated. Markets that were once viewed as crown jewels are now being eyed as potential divestments. And Luckin isn't stopping at China. In a reversal of traditional globalization patterns, the Chinese coffee chain is now expanding into the United States. Locations have opened in major American cities, bringing the same low-cost, app-driven model that proved successful in China. It's a perfect inversion of the expected narrative, the American brand retreating while the Chinese competitor advances into its home market. This shift carries implications beyond just quarterly earnings reports. Every market Starbucks exits represents diminished American cultural influence in regions where soft power and commercial presence have historically reinforced each other. When American brands withdraw, they leave not just profits behind, but also the subtle cultural connections that shape how foreign populations perceive the United States. China's government understands this dynamic perfectly. Supporting domestic brands like Luckin isn't merely about corporate profits. It's about economic sovereignty and cultural assertion. As Chinese companies grow stronger in consumer-facing sectors, they reduce dependence on Western brands and increase China's ability to shape global consumption patterns. For Starbucks, the Chinese market has transformed from a growth engine into a strategic liability. The company that once seemed positioned to dominate Asian coffee culture now faces the real possibility of being marginalized in its most important international market. And the trade policies that were supposed to pressure China have instead accelerated this very outcome. This represents a fundamental miscalculation in America's trade strategy. Tariffs were meant to force Chinese companies to bend to American demands. Instead, they've given Chinese competitors both motive and opportunity to build alternatives to American brands. As costs rise for U.S. companies operating abroad, Chinese rivals gain competitive advantages they wouldn't have achieved through market competition alone. And the pattern extends beyond coffee. Technology, automotive, retail, entertainment. Across sectors, Chinese companies are using this moment to reduce dependence on American products and build domestic alternatives. Years from now, historians may look back at this period as the moment when American commercial dominance in China began its irreversible decline. But the damage isn't confined to international markets. Back home in the United States, the consequences of Starbucks' struggles are rippling through industries and communities that depend on its operations. The economic chain reaction spreading through American industries. When a company the size of Starbucks contracts, it doesn't suffer alone. The economic impact radiates outward through dozens of interconnected industries, hitting businesses and workers who never appear in headlines but feel the consequences just as severely. This is where abstract trade policy becomes painfully concrete. In the lost trucking routes, the canceled construction contracts, the shuttered packaging plants, and the thousands of livelihoods that depend on economic networks most people never see. Consider the logistics sector. Starbucks doesn't operate its own fleet of trucks to supply thousands of stores nationwide. It contracts with freight companies, regional distributors, and long-haul carriers who specialize in food service delivery. These companies plan routes, hire drivers, and invest in equipment based on expected volumes and consistent demand from major clients. When Starbucks closes 400 stores, delivery requirements collapse. Routes that once justified weekly service now need deliveries every 2 or 3 weeks. Trucks that ran fully loaded now travel half empty. For logistics companies operating on margins of 5% or less, that kind of volume loss can mean the difference between profitability and bankruptcy. Drivers lose routes, dispatchers lose shifts, and small trucking operations that depended on Starbucks contracts find themselves scrambling for replacement business in an already competitive market. The packaging industry faces similar disruption. Starbucks purchases billions of cups, lids, sleeves, and containers annually. Suppliers have built entire production lines around these contracts, hiring workers and investing in equipment specifically to meet Starbucks specifications. When store closures reduce demand, those specialized facilities can't simply redirect production elsewhere. The result? Reduced shifts, deferred equipment upgrades, and in some cases, plant closures in communities where manufacturing jobs are already scarce. Construction contractors experience their own version of this pain. Starbucks store build-outs and renovations represent steady, lucrative work for specialized crews. Interior designers, electricians, plumbers, and general contractors have developed expertise in Starbucks projects over years of consistent business. When the company freezes expansion and cancels remodeling plans, those contracts vanish. Workers go home. Small contractors who'd planned their annual revenue around Starbucks projects face cash flow crises. Some survive by finding alternative clients. Others don't. Even industries seemingly distant from coffee feel the impact. Furniture manufacturers who supply Starbucks stores see order volumes decline. Cleaning service companies lose contracts as locations close. Point-of-sale technology providers and payment processors see transaction volumes drop. Music licensing agencies lose royalty revenue as store closures reduce public performance hours. Commercial real estate values decline in neighborhoods where Starbucks served as an anchor tenant. This is what economists call a multiplier effect. One company's contraction generates cascading consequences throughout the broader economy. And Starbucks is just one corporation. Now consider what happens as tariff pressures affect hundreds of companies simultaneously across multiple sectors.